welcome to this week's episode, or this month's episode of Opportunity Knocks. This is your host, the Rev Raw, also known as Matthew. This week, our normal guest host, Angie B, is out taking care of her family and things. So this week, I have our guest host, Merrie V. Merrie, introduce yourself.
Hey, this is Merrie Valdemar. I'm with CHICA, which is a cooperative in the Inland Empire that stands for Chicano Indigenous Community for Culturally Conscious Advocacy and Action. Thanks so much, Matt, for having us here today. As always, we love being on the mic with the Rev Raw, and we hope the community out there is listening and joining in on the conversation.
Cool. So today, before the show got started, we were actually talking about a couple different issues. Mm-hmm. Merrie, where did you want to start today?
Well, what's been all over like social media and the news and everybody's Facebook page has been the whole thing with Kavanaugh and talking about the Me Too campaign and how we're dealing as a society with sexual harassment, with rape, with sexual assault, with domestic violence, with all these issues that really cause us to take a hard look at women and other vulnerable survivors who have been having to deal with a lot of patriarchy and machismo and aggression and violence, and how we're dealing with that as a community, I think, is the big question I want to ask. Like, how are you dealing with it?
Right. So before we get really started and dive deep into the conversation, I do just want to give the trigger warning now that this episode will be talking about sexual assault and other sensitive topics. So for those that may have been victim or may have been impacted by it, if you do not want to hear a episode or a show that is about that topic, please turn away now.
Thank you for that, Matt. I really appreciate the trigger warning. I think it's really important that folks have a prep that this conversation is going to happen. So thank you for that.
My pleasure. So now that we've given some time, let's jump back into it. Did you want to start, or did you want me to kind of start?
Yeah, go ahead and start.
So we were having a conversation, and I had to share a little bit about right now with everything that's been going on. I, as a person that was assigned male at birth, I feel like it's hard to be a man right now. Mm. And I feel embarrassed. I feel just disappointed because I feel like we are being raised and we're a part of this culture that has just said it's okay to do this to women, mm-hmm. and to do this to people that don't have power. Mm-hmm. And it's something that is appalling. And I want folks who are out there that have power to step up and say something, and say that this is wrong. I saw something also this morning that kind of threw me off, where it's people that are still wanting to defend Kavanaugh and say, oh, he was just a boy. This is a thing that boys do. If this is a thing that boys do, we need to change this whole system now. Mm-hmm. Everyone who's been a parent, y'all need a slap on the wrist or a smack in the head. We need something, because that's not right. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And again, like I was telling you, this, for me, just has me all emotional right now.
Yeah.
Because I want to know that there's more that we can do. And I want to know that, it's not too late for us, if that makes sense.
Yes, that absolutely makes sense. I feel you so much. I think part of the struggle about talking about this topic or these topics is that society in general doesn't give us permission to sit in this uncomfortable place and really look at what is going wrong, what has been going wrong for a very, very long time, there's still so many people that think that rape and sexual harassment is about sex. Hello, it is not about sex.
Right.
It is about power, which is why we see that the survivors, and I really purposefully use survivors and not victims, because I think that we have to change the culture where we center the conversation around survivors, and by default, we also center the conversation around the invisibility of those who have not survived.
Yes.
So like, let's talk about survivors and not victims so that we can, really look at what it is that survivors need and not, always center the conversation around the justice that surrounds the injustice or justice that surrounds, offenders or predators. Cause I think that society puts way too much spotlight on Kavanaugh and not enough spotlight on the invisibility of women, children, trans community, like vulnerable folks at every level who don't have a conversation or a media highlight about their sexual assault, rape, trauma, and ultimately death for some of these people. Like, I know within my own family, I have heard from my family members that we have folks who are survivors that never got justice. They never got justice from the courts. They never got justice from the community. They never got justice from even within the family. Like, there's so much silencing and a refusal to talk about these things. There's so much stigma around it. And it's just like, at some point, we have to stop that cycle, cycle that says the silence is okay. We have to start having these conversations like in a real way that centers the fact that it's about power, that centers the fact that women, children, LGBTQ folks, people of color, people of different abilities are vulnerable, and that it's about power and not about sex. And how can we lift and empower those voices and make sure that they're heard? And one movement that I see doing that I really appreciate is the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women. You can look up that hashtag MMIW. And I recently was at the People's Climate March, marching with the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women, and they're doing the Women Warrior song and being a part of the California Native folks on Ohlone land that were leading the climate march. But at the end of the day, the thing that I carry away with me about that is that, really looking at the folks who are invisible to this conversation, who don't have that spotlight, is super important. And that means that we have to look at folks who have passed on to the other world and never got healing and never got justice. And that has to be our motivation for change.
I just want to look something up real quick. With listening to everything that you said, one thing that I've noticed with talking about social media is when we talk about these hashtags, there's that hashtag, I think it's Stop Kavanaugh. But then when it comes to Dr. Ford, it's I Believe Her. Like, why is it that we're not putting a name to her? Why is it that that's being taken out? And again, and even with the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's hashtag, it's hashtag MMIW. And I almost feel like I like that. I really agree with that. But I also feel like that takes away from us not naming some of these women, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's what's so beautiful about the Say Her Name movement, right?
Yes.
Like, is that it does still say her name, but then right after that is the hashtag that says her name.
Yes, exactly.
So it's like I totally agree. And the default for society is, that we're going to protect and we're going to highlight the names of the offenders, right? Like, everybody knows the name R. Kelly.
Right.
And everybody knows the name, Bill Cosby.
Yes.
And everybody knows the name Kavanaugh.
Right.
But how many people really know the names of their survivors?
Yes.
Or more importantly, the people who passed and never got justice or healing, right? Like, who knows those names? And that's the Say Her Name campaign. So I totally agree. I also think that the conversation, we have to get to a place where this generation understands and accepts the accountability for the previous generations that did not do the right thing. So I love my family, but the fact that previous generations did not break this cycle, that it was continued in silence and nobody was willing to say enough is enough and break the cycle and speak about the incidents that happened so that it could not be continued to future generations, like that's the problem. The silence is the problem, because this is like a sickness that festers in the dark. And once you shine light on it, once you expose it, it can no longer grow.
Right.
You know, and that's the piece that we're missing. So for our generation, that's a really hard conversation, because it means we have to acknowledge that previous generations didn't do this, and we have to take upon our shoulders the strength to stop the silence and talk about it at every level, at the family level, at the community level, at the governmental level, at the societal level, at the global level. And we have to shine so much light on it that it kills this fungus that is really related, I think, rooted in patriarchy and oppression. And I think it's a lot bigger than just these little, incidents, or not even little incidents, but the little incidents that we hear of is just like the tip of the iceberg of what is really, really going on.
Now, do you think, and I'm just unpacking this right now, do you think that a part of maybe the solution would be to better create our sexual health classes around this topic, talking about what sexual assault is, talking about what sexual harassment is, talking about what slut shaming is? I mean, all of these things are impacting our youth and, as you mentioned, these other communities. But I think that if we take on this accountability, and if we say we're stopping this, we have to get this before it can get to that next level. When kids are first coming up and they're getting these hormones and they don't completely understand what's going on with their bodies, I think that that's the time when we can really get in and say, okay, look, we understand that you have these feelings and these emotions and these things are going on. These are the things you need to be aware of, and really bring up and talk about these stories so people understand this is something that can happen, and these are the steps we're taking to stop it from happening, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think part of the problem is, like, how do you have conversations with this about this with young people without saying or inferring that young people are doing something to bring this on, right? Like without inferring that they're complicit in the bad behavior of folks in power. And folks in power could be adults. Folks in power could be wealthy people. Folks in power can be, people who are able-bodied versus people who have different abilities. Folks in power can be, it can be a lot of things, So it's like, how do we have conversations with young folks and other vulnerable folks without telling them it's your responsibility to protect yourself against these predators that might be out there? Instead of having conversations, which is like your point you initially made about how do we stop raising predators? How do we stop raising people who, when they come into a position of power, think it's okay to exploit folks who are vulnerable? And I think that happens in a lot of ways other than just sex. Like, if we look at the police brutality movement, like against police brutality, like Black Lives Matter. If we look at all types of movements like labor exploitation, if we look at what's happening to Mother Earth, there's a reason why people say that Mother Earth is being raped and use that language. Like, it is all boiled down to the same thing, right? Which is the abuse of power, and that we are raising whole societies full of young people that view power as the ultimate success in whatever that looks like. And how do we stop that? Where does that conversation stop? And I think that it has a lot to do with Western society specifically and colonization,
So it's funny that you say, where does that conversation stop? And I was going to ask, where does that conversation begin? Because I think, again, as we're seeing how literally parts of history are being taken out of history books. So does that mean that we have to really rewrite the history books and start with, our history is built on power. Our history is built on colonization and taking away land that didn't belong to us.
Yes.
And taking people and making them, you know what I mean? Making them property and they didn't belong to us. You know, like, how do we start that conversation?
Well, let's unpack that. Like, you know, think about the kindergarten classroom, the typical kindergarten classroom. And, you know, we're right now just entering October. It's the fall. What's the conversation going to be? Columbus.
Yep.
Thanksgiving.
Yep.
You know, pilgrims.
Yep.
And like, we're going to start our youngest minds at the most, you know, moldable ages with the very first lesson they learn is colonization.
Yes.
And we lie to them about it.
Yes.
Flat out lie to them. We don't tell them that Native people were raped.
Yep.
We don't tell them that they were cut, their hair was cut. We don't tell them that their language was stolen from them.
Yep.
We don't tell them the truth about the mission system. We don't tell them the truth. We don't tell them the truth about anything. That was all about power and politics and the land grab, you know, for the purpose of power, you know. And so it's just like, if we're molding our youth from that very beginning grade of kindergarten with that mentality, then we just continue it throughout, right?
Right.
Which is like, you know, how do we get ethnic studies in kindergarten, in pre-K? Like, how do we change the whole dialogue about that? And, you know, that's a real challenge because right now our school system is not there, you know, and we're not even there at the college level.
Right.
You can get a college degree right now in teaching. You can get a teaching degree and never having taken an ethnic studies course at all. So you can basically get a teaching degree and have no cultural competency. And you're in charge of teaching the future. You know, that's the future right there, you know. So, like, until we make some fundamental changes, like you said, in the way that we educate and talk about those things, and I think we have to ask ourselves, are we going to rely on the school system to do that? Or are we going to start having those conversations in the community? Are we going to take back the power of who is teaching our children?
Right.
And are we going to start having those conversations around the dinner table?
And to piggyback on that a little bit, I think that in some families, some of that education does happen. But the problem that follows that is once the kids get to school and they start bringing real knowledge, then the people that are trained, and that's quotation trained, start to try and counter that knowledge. And they try and use whatever has been canned or created by the system to say, well, that's not exactly how it happened. And then, I mean, the question really is, so please tell us the truth. What really did happen? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I don't know that people are prepared to do that.
Yeah. Oh, no, absolutely. And I think about, like, even just the representation that we have in the school system right now. Like, I work at a community college, a local community college, and we serve a community that's 70-80% Latino, Chicano, you know, whatever you want to call it. And at the end of the day, we only have, say, 13% Latino faculty and staff. So our teachers in the classroom do not reflect the community that we are in, you know?
Yes.
And so there's a huge disconnect in terms of cultural competency when our youth are not seeing brown and black faces in the classroom that represent them. And when they bring up or try to bring up a conversation about pilgrims versus Indians, you know, like, what kind of response do they get? You know, what kind of reaction do they get in the classroom? Is that conversation supported? Is that conversation quietly shut down? You know, like, what happens? And I think I'm really blessed to have seen recently a generation of new teachers coming into the classroom. We were with some of them last night at California Indian Day. And, you know, these are new teachers coming into the classrooms in our local school districts. And they're coming with the perspective of trying to decolonize the classroom, you know, and we desperately need that. Like, I want to give a shout out to, like, the homies Gullet and Jasmine and the future teachers like Paula and Laura and some of the folks that we've been working with who are really trying to figure it out. Like, what does this look like and how can I do this? And I think that we have an obligation to support them. But we also have an obligation to keep pushing this conversation out into the community so that when they get to the classroom, they're not inundated with a bunch of complaints from a community that doesn't understand what they're doing.
Right.
You know?
And I think that I'm just going to say, I feel like that really crosses so many lines. So many lines. Right now, with going to seminary, one of the biggest things that they had as a preliminary is there's an eco course, which is educating to counter oppression. Everyone is required to take that class. And literally, it's a class filled with, so for some of you that are out there and have been following my journey, I originally started seminary in 2015 at a Christian school. And so now I'm going to a UU, or Universalist Unitarian specific school that is, I'm going to say they're realistically woke. They realize that the world that we are in now needs a certain kind of healing. And a lot of it is based on our interconnectedness and our interdependence, meaning that there are all these movements that are happening, but they are all connected. And we all need one another to survive. It's not this one group is fighting this fight. No, we all need to be fighting this fight to be able to change what's happening because of power. So with this course, it was interesting because, these books that are being brought up to us talk about, so like the Indigenous movement, talk about what it's like to be an African American person. There's one that was really emphasized was talking about like the poor people's campaign, and how so many of us have at some point lived below the poverty line, but we make it work. And again, this isn't just a Black and brown problem. This is a people problem. And so many times people want to forget that because they're going after that power. They're going after those positions that put them above someone else and forgetting those marginalized groups.
Ooh, you're speaking my language right now, Matt. Oh, you're so speaking my language. We recently went to the People's Climate March in San Francisco, and we were there in deep solidarity with the Indigenous bloc, on a lonely land, and really with them in their struggle. And there's, of course, a lot of big NGOs, nonprofit, industrial complex organizations at the table, funding everything and behind the scenes of all the planning. And so we had this march on a lonely land, and it's 30,000 people. And the focus is supposed to be Indigenous-led, Black, brown, like all that, right? And we get there. We've gotten funding to get a bus full of our Inland Empire folks there who are wanting, craving, starved for these connections with Chicano and Indigenous community, right? Like they want to know more. They're craving it. And so the next morning, we were supposed to be a part of this sacred ceremony at the Shell Mound, which is the Ohlone people's sacred site. And the people in power, the decision makers, decided, no, we're not going to go to that ceremony. We're going to take the bus back to the Inland Empire, and we're just not going to participate in the sacred discussion about these folks who have been basically fighting power and oppression at the local level in the Bay, and they're Indigenous folks. And it's just like, folks came back, the bus left, and a few of us stayed because we didn't take the bus and we could stay, but everybody who wanted to go, had to come back to the Inland Empire. And it was so unnecessary. And so for me, it was such a clear example of the disconnect between people who are doing different movement building for power versus people who are doing movement building for the intersection that you're talking about, who understand that there is no environmental justice without the respect and acknowledgement of Indigenous people. That they were the Earth's first caretakers, and that you cannot say those words out of your mouth like you're woke.
Right.
And like the phrase that they used was climate woke throughout the whole march. And we were just like, that is so unwoke to say that. Like, it's like you're saying this out of one side of your mouth, and then out of the other side of your mouth, you're dissing and disrespecting the Indigenous people of this land, and we're just like, it's a perfect example of what you're talking about, which is the power grab, the power play, the people who are in the movement to take power away from the oppressors, but then they want to wield that power against other people who are also oppressed, And that's the part where we have to say there is no revolution without women.
Right.
There is no revolution without LGBTQ.
Right.
There is no revolution without brown and black and people with different abilities and undocumented and all this. There is no revolution without that. And if you're still on a page of not understanding that in a real intersectional way, where you are listening very closely to what it is that people want and making decisions based on what the people want, not what you want, not what makes you comfortable. Not if you're a person in a decision-making position, in a position of power, and you're making decisions because you don't want to be uncomfortable, you don't want to be called out, you don't want to be told that you're doing X, Y, Z wrong, then you are not the person to be in that position of power. And even if it's a nonprofit, even if it's a community org, even if it's one of those agencies, if you are not listening to what it is that the community needs and wants, then, a change needs to happen.
Right.
And that's where I really feel all these issues we're talking about, from the sexual assault, sexual harassment, rape, to Mother Earth, to climate justice, to all the things that we've been mentioning here, the education system, it comes down to the same fundamental principle, which is how do we empower this next generation of youth? How do we empower them that they are not silenced, that they are not invisible, that they are not told that they have to just keep going along with the status quo, that they are in a position where they feel comfortable being uncomfortable, and that they get the support they need to get healing, to hold accountability, and to do ultimately self-care, right? That's the ultimate goal, is for them to be able to do self-care. What's more empowering than being able to do self-care? But it doesn't come without the sacrifice of some generation to say enough, to break the cycle, to stop everything and say, these folks have not gotten justice. These folks have not gotten healing, and stop the clock and make it happen. And that's the part I see missing. People know about it, but they're not willing to stop the clock and stop time and actually take accountability for the fact that the folks who have left this world without healing or justice there needs to be accountability held for that,
And I think when we were really at the beginning of our conversation talking about sexual assault, I think that is really important in that work. Just because, as we were having some pre-conversation before we got started today, and literally, between us, literally talking about almost every woman that we each know has had some type of sexual assault. That's insane.
Yeah, we keep hearing statistics about 1 out of 6 or 1 out of 4. By my count, in my hood, and it ain't even women, it's 1 out of 2 people.
Yes.
We're talking men and women.
Yes.
And LGBTQ, all gender identities. It's the numbers astonish me. And I've been doing this work for a minute. And it's I am still shocked by the sheer numbers of folks who have had these experiences and never, ever got justice or healing. It's not just the number of incidents that happen, it's the number of incidents that go unheard, invisible, no justice. That's the real trauma of it.
I want to give a shout out to those folks who a couple of days ago on Twitter started to post their Why I Did Report stories, and even those folks that did the same on Facebook, because for some of those folks, literally I remember reading this one lady's post where she put it out there and said, until this moment, the only other person that she had ever told her story was her husband. And it's when you have these type situations that happen, there's no wonder that people don't report if you take it to your family and your family doesn't want to do anything about it. You know what I mean?
Yes.
Or, you take it to law enforcement and law enforcement doesn't want to do anything.
Oh, yeah.
You know what I mean?
Oh, I can go on a whole nother page on that. Like, we were talking about that earlier. Like, I recently had an experience where I had a glimpse of someone who, like, was stalker status, you know? Mm-hmm. And I was one of those people that went to the police, had evidence, had this and that. And the police were like, we can't do anything until he actually does something. Like, you know, he could threaten all day, you know, but the laws are literally, and I say literally, not written to protect vulnerable communities, especially women, you know, like it's just the law says that the police don't have to do anything until there's actually harmful action. So threats, you know, stalking, surveillance, you know, cameras, none of those things in themselves are illegal. And so ultimately the police will not pursue it, you know, and it's just like, what kind of world do we live in where you have to get, you know, assaulted or killed in order to even try to get justice against someone like a stalker, you know? And I think that there's a whole movement about that too, about changing the laws here in California, because we really need to pay closer attention. My guess is many of these missing and murdered Indigenous women were stalked before they were ever missing or murdered. And it's just, you know, the law is written in such a way that there is no protection. So again, it goes back to empowerment. Like they're looking for vulnerable folks. And how do we create a spotlight that is shown on these things so that it can't continue to happen with impunity, with no consequences, with no accountability?
Right.
How do we stop that cycle? And I think this conversation is a way that we can start and encouraging more people to have these conversations with the people they love, the people they know, you know, and to talk about, for survivors to talk about it when they're ready to tell their story, but to tell their story and to tell their story as loudly and as possible, you know, at every level, from the family level to the community, to society, to getting up on the, you know, bullhorn and shouting it in the street if you have to, like whatever we have to do to project that conversation louder and be more visible. That's what we all need to do. And especially our accomplices, like you said, who have power.
Yes. One thing I just wanted to throw out there was in a recent conversation, I was telling a colleague that I think the biggest thing that really helps in doing some of this work is creating and holding space. That doesn't mean that you have to go in and have this full formal agenda. Just create a space where people can actually come in, sit down as they're comfortable, and if they want to share their story, they can, or they can just sit there.
Yeah.
You know, just holding that space. So at least, you know, like you mentioned earlier, sometimes people have this anger and this righteous anger that they need to get out.
Yes.
Sometimes they just need a space where they can go and yell and scream at the top of their lungs. Vent. And just get it out. And then we can start working on that healing.
Yeah, absolutely. I think people totally fail to understand that there's a grief process. And that when you experience trauma, you need to go through the grief process. And that the stages of that include anger, revenge, like, you know, like outrage, like all these emotions, you know, sadness, like whatever. It's like that people need space to experience these emotions. So that's what I kind of mean by we have to be the generation to stop. Like we have to be the generation who is willing to sit there, and even though we didn't physically do anything to anybody, we need to let survivors like tell us, you know, this is what happened to me and I'm angry about it. You know, we need to be the people who are willing to bear that suffering of their anger, of their outrage, of whatever emotions that they're feeling that are going to get them on a path towards healing, right? Because if we don't allow them, if we silence them, if we continue to tone police them, if we continue to say, oh, you just need to sit there quietly and forgive whoever did this to you, or, oh, you just need to like go to the justice system and rely on the police and the courts to take care of it, Or, oh, like, if we continue to do that, like, we're going to continue to have people that leave this earth and never get the healing that we promised them. Like, that's the bottom line.
And it's just crazy because this was on, I think it was Twitter, and I'm forgetting the actress's name, but it was 2 years ago that she reported that she was just sexually assaulted. And it's like, here we are in this time and in these movements where we're moving towards being woke. And right, we're and that's in quotation marks, woke for y'all out there who can't see us. And literally 2 years ago, someone was sexually assaulted. And I know that the numbers and statistics are crazy because probably during this conversation, there's probably been at least 2 to 3 people that have been assaulted in some way.
Yes.
And this is something that, we have to live with. We have to acknowledge that this is a part of the culture that we are in right now. And I think you're right, that empowering folks and letting them know it's okay. You can have this voice. You can know that at this moment, we are stopping this. We are looking for justice and whatever that justice means. Because I know that that's something that I've seen a lot as well is people are talking about, we're already convicting Kavanaugh and he hasn't had a fair trial. With the amount of evidence that is coming up, just like Bill Cosby, how can you have 54 women come forward and say that you sexually assaulted them, plus you admit to giving them things to loosen them up, and at the same time, people are outraged that people want to prosecute him.
Yeah, and then my thing would be, okay, let's take that same situation and apply it to, say, a black trans woman.
Yes.
53 people come out and say a black trans woman did X, Y, and Z. That person is going to prison or is, going to be killed or murdered, by the police or whoever else, right? Without a trial, without any justice, and nobody bats an eye. Nobody bats an eye, right? And it's because it's about power and not about, anything else. It's about power. And when we look at who are the most disempowered folks in our society, those are the folks who don't, only one person has to accuse them of something and they don't get justice.
I'm on Emmett Till. Who remembers the Emmett Till story? And then the fact that his accuser has come out years later and said she lied. Not to take away from survivors, but just looking at the idea of what power looks like and how, depending on who the person is as a perpetrator, the justice is different. Yeah. As a person of color or even just being LGBT, there are different rules that apply to us. Yeah. And it's not fair. And I know that people are already out there like, well, life isn't fair. Yeah, life isn't fair. But when there's such a huge power differential and people can get pats on the back and say, well, he was just a youngster. We don't want to ruin his potential career. So what if she was passed out in an alley? She shouldn't have passed out in the alley. He didn't know any better. He didn't have any chances with women, so he kind of took that moment. It's like, how are we saying that that's okay? That's all assault. Yeah. And it's this differential that is being created to say that as long as you're a person who has this potential, who has the potential to go to like a Harvard or something like that. Who's
rich, who's famous, who's an actor, who's like an athlete or whatever. Yeah.
But you get these different consequences. And many times it's not a consequence. Yeah. Many times it's a career. Or getting a nomination for the highest court in the country where there's really no expiration other than your death. It makes no sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what's really profound about that is the idea that what injustice looks like for someone who's wealthy and powerful is, like you said, maybe it cost them their career. Maybe it cost them some money, a false accusation, But what justice or injustice looks like for a person of color, for a trans person, for an undocumented person, for those folks, for child migrants, what injustice looks like for them is death.
Yes.
That's the difference, right? Injustice over here is an inconvenience. Injustice here, where you have no power, for those folks who have no power, the injustice means your life.
Yep.
You know, and when we're talking about lives, like thousands of lives, and I'll circle it right back to the missing and murdered Indigenous women, right? Right.
Yes.
We have thousands and thousands of missing and murdered Indigenous women by a far higher rate than any other category. And these women are not even investigated, not even looked for, not even, there isn't, and it's the people who are perpetrating that, you know, they are, you know, using the laws, like the laws of the res, to get away with murder, like go on the res, kill somebody, leave the res, and don't get prosecuted. You know, they know what they're doing. And this is happening not just in this country, but in Canada, like around the globe, to Indigenous women all over the place. And where is the outcry? Where is the outcry? As much as I am with, you know, lifting the words of Miss Ford and her experience, I'm also like, where is the outcry for missing and murdered Indigenous women?
Yes.
For trans women of color,
yes.
for undocumented women, you know, it like there is not the same level of outrage by the community, and there needs to be. And we need to do a better job of like making sure that every single case of sexual assault, rape, all these situations of violence against vulnerable folks, and period, is treated with the same outrage.
Yes. And I agree. Because I know one of and I want to highlight this for a moment, is the idea that when we're talking about LGBT folks, many times the amount of reporting goes down because when you're dealing with people that are trans or gender non-binary, they're misgendered. You know, the names that they were living with, those are not honored. So you're seeing these names that are birth names that do not really represent who they are. And so I remember reading a story recently where there was a trans woman that was killed. And again, the first thing is man dressed as a woman found murdered XYZ place. Why are we taking away the honor and the respect and the value of that trans woman's life? She was a woman.
Yeah.
And no, instead you'd prefer to misgender her because then that takes down that importance.
Yes.
And again, you know, she's not a person. She doesn't matter. Sorry, I'm frustrated.
I completely agree. I think that kind of brings me to, like, I know we normally, when we wrap up these podcasts, we talk about announcements, you know?
Yeah.
And that brings me, right to Trans Day of Remembrance.
Oh, yes.
Which is coming up, you know? And I want to give a shout out to, the homie Darby, who, organizes the, Royalty on the Roof in Riverside. And that's a beautiful event. If you haven't been there, look up hashtag Royalty on the Roof.
Yes.
And he does a wonderful event highlighting, you know, trans folks who have been killed and lifting their voices and saying their names, you know, like, so that it's really clear. And there's also going to be a Trans Day of Remembrance events in the Riverside and San Bernardino. And we're going to really try to help put some promotion out there to lift that, so that more people are aware of those names that need to be remembered. And then also coming up in a couple weeks, we have Indigenous Peoples Day on October 10th at San Bernardino Valley College, where we will also be lifting the names of some of the missing and murdered Indigenous women. And we will also be talking about a lot of the different cultures around the world that have been suffering violence because of oppression, because of power, and at all different levels, like what we can do as our community to support these folks and bring on healing. So that's the conversation I'm really anxious to have, to really kind of like not just talk about the problem, but let's talk about the solution.
Right. So before we wrap up and get out of here, just one last thing. Earlier you were talking about some conversations you had in your family. So my question to you is, Merrie, with everything we've said, what is the possibility of what justice looks like?
I really feel that justice is going to be determined by this generation and our ability to really focus on healing the suffering of survivors and lifting the voices of survivors. We have to get better at how can we not get so focused on, well, why didn't you report in a timely manner? And how come you didn't go to the police? And where is the court case for this? And blah, 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 blah. I think we have to take justice into our hands as a community. And what that looks like is healing. How do we get survivors to a point where they are feeling healed and empowered? And that means we got to give them voice, like you said, for that outrage, that righteous rage that they have. They need to have a mic to be able to lift that up and say it. I'm a survivor myself, and I've been very blessed that I've had ample opportunity to lift my voice and really protect members of my family, especially my daughter, from having the same experience that I have and breaking that cycle. But it wasn't through the court. It wasn't through the police department. It wasn't through vengeance or any kind of physical, entity that I got that healing from. It was from my own voice. I got healing from exercising my own voice, telling my story, lifting the stories of the vulnerable folks around me, and creating a path towards healing. That's how I got justice. And I'm still working on it, to be honest. My offender is still living, and I often have to deal with the fact that I have been asked to be in the same room or space as him. And to my disappointment, the generation before me doesn't protect me from that. So I have to break that cycle and protect others from that, the generation that comes after me, and teach them, most importantly, teach them how to protect themselves and how to protect each other and not be dependent on the system or the police or anybody else to do that. We have the power as the community to protect each other. If we circle around each other, if we go into homes where we know there's a predator and camp out in the living room until that predator leaves, there are things we can physically do as a community to protect each other. We have to be willing to take the risk, to stand up, to speak out, to be the generation that breaks the cycle. That's what I want. I want to be the generation that breaks the cycle. And that's what I would ask everybody else to do.
Wow. So, I guess last thoughts. Again, Merrie, thank you for coming and being my guest host today. This has been a conversation that I hope we can keep going. And folks out there that are listening, please speak up if you can. I know that, sometimes the world seems crazy and it seems like there's a lot on your plate. Know that we love you. We hear you. I'm going to say this last one. It's going to be controversial, but we forgive you for feeling like you can't do enough. It's okay. Do what you can. Make the difference in the way that you know how.
I'll add to that. Forgive yourself. Forgive yourself. I think that's really important. The art of forgiving yourself. And I think that means talking to a lot of voices in your head that are telling you you're not doing enough, that are telling you XYZ is your fault, that are telling you you should have done this, you should have done that. That voice that tells you, what you should have done, what you could have been, la la la. That regretful voice. Forgive yourself for that voice.
Yes.
Not for your actions.
No.
And forgive yourself for that voice and then, refocus that conversation in your head on your own self-care and healing. And do that not in isolation, but with who can I bring along with me on that journey? Who can I bring along with me to that circle? Who can I bring along with me to that conversation? Who can I take with me out to nature? How can I do that for my whole community and not just for myself?
So until we meet again, this has been Opportunity Knocks. Thank you for being present and sharing this journey with us. Until we see you next time.
Thank you, Ra. Bye.
My pleasure.